put in place to support Cambridge businesses. So on to the main bulk of our session. Running today's session, covering the fundamentals of net zero and how to understand your business's carbon emissions, is Anne Miller. She's an expert in innovation and creativity. She has over 35 years practical experience in technological innovation, organisational change and sustainability. And the main focus of Anne's work is helping with a transition to a low carbon economy. So I'll just get you on to Anne. You're on mute, Anne.
Thank you. Thank you. How many years has it been? Thank you, Jasmine. So there's rightfully a lot of interest these days in getting to net zero, but there's also a lot of confusion about how to do it, especially for small businesses and social enterprises. How do you genuinely put your organisation on a path to net zero without having to either devote your entire life to calculating carbon emissions or being accused of greenwash or lack of ambition? And it's understandable because the field's moving really fast and there's a lot of greenwash around. But it's really important to get it right, particularly for any business. Your reputation for being honest and doing things right is a fundamental asset. So today I'm going to share with you some emerging principles and frameworks that I find really helpful. And overall, my aim is that after this session, you'll understand how to get your organisation on a sound path to net zero. We'll also do a bit of jargon busting. And then in the session next week, same time this week, same time next week, with David Knight of Peterborough Environment City Trust, he'll focus on the very practical things that you can do to improve the energy efficiency of your business. So as Jasmine said, if you have any questions or ideas to share, do put them in the chat and I'll take questions at the end of each of the section that we're looking at today. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so the agenda for today is firstly, why decarbonize? Secondly, understanding carbon emissions. Thirdly, setting and communicating your target. And finally, understanding offsetting. And at the end of each of those sections, we'll have an opportunity for questions and a bit of discussion. So why decarbonize? Well, firstly, there's the moral imperative. It's, I think, it's morally completely unacceptable not to be taking action. Secondly, there is a business imperative. The world is changing fast, and it's really quite exciting what's happening in the business world. So firstly, by looking at decarbonisation, it's about cutting costs and increasing profits. Why spend money on energy that you don't have to spend, particularly with the forecast increases in energy prices? Secondly, it's really interesting how the larger companies are all looking at decarbonising their supply chains, addressing what's called scope 3 carbon emissions. And I'll explain what that means later. And what that means is that they're saying they want to get to net zero, and they're going to be asking you as their suppliers, what are you doing to get to net zero? And knowing how big companies are, they will probably try and put as much of the burden on you as possible. So you need to be prepared. Secondly, there's customer expectation. Thirdly, staff recruitment, retention, which for certainly some businesses around here is a real problem, real issue, particularly in the tech sector. Much of my business has been about creativity and innovation, and it's really interesting when you start looking at how can we cut carbon. It is a framing for thinking creatively about your business, and often that enables you to open new markets, gives you new ideas, new opportunities in very interesting ways. And then finally, actually, it's about reputation, enhancing your reputation, and it's a real imperative. I've put a link at the bottom of this slide to a resource from the Carbon Trust, which is, I think, a really excellent little summary presentation of what you can do, and also share some of these business benefits of doing this. So if we now move on to understanding your carbon emissions, how do you get started? What are the frameworks? So the first thing to do is to measure and declare the emissions from your own operations, what's called scope 1 and scope 2. And in the next slide, I'll explain what I mean by scope 1 and scope 2. Secondly, commit to a target to reduce them. And I very much like the science-based target initiative. It doesn't say you've got to do it today. It says you've got to get onto a path to actually be net zero. And then you start reducing them. But if you don't know what they are to start with, you can't meaningfully start reducing them. So then to go further, you include the key emissions from your value chain, the things you buy, the things that you sell, and that's your scope 3 emissions. And you can pay voluntary compensation for your emissions, and I'll explain all those as we're going through. And so this sounds like jargon. Scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. What is it? It's really important and useful to be clear, because then that will help you unpack the greenwash from others, as well as making sure that when you talk about your own carbon emissions, you are not being accused of greenwash. So scope 1 is the direct emissions from fuel that you yourself use in your business. So typically it would be the gas for heating your office, or maybe it's oil if you've got oil-fired boilers. It's the fuel for your company vehicles, the diesel or the petrol. If you buy heat, process heat for manufacturing, it's the process heat. And if you actually emit refrigerant gases or methane, it would be those emissions too. So it's direct fuel in your business. Scope 2 is purchased energy. So that typically, the most important thing is electricity. And if you buy heat or steam, it's purchased heat and steam. It's made elsewhere, and then you're buying the energy. So it's very narrow. It's basically just the fuel and the electricity in your organization over which you have full control. Scope 3 is basically more as everything else over which you have influence. It's the indirect emissions in your whole value chain. And as I'm pointing out here, in many, many businesses, scope 3 is 90% or more of the total. I mean, it's some of the things are easy to quantify and some of them are really hard, but they're all things where you can make a difference. So most notably, it's purchased goods and services. You know, are you buying your components from China? In which case there's probably quite a bit of travel involved. Are they air freighted? Are they shipped? How do you distribute the things that you make to your customers? Are they downloads? Are they sent by air? Are they sent surface? The business travel that you do in your operation, if it was your maintenance crews going out in your own vehicles, that would count as scope 1 fuel. But if it's heading off to the States on a business trip, that would be in scope 3. Your employee commuting, or let's say if you run an event, the attendees coming to your massive gig, that's scope 3. The use of the sold products. This is a get out that the likes of Shell and BP use. They carefully don't include their scope 3 emissions. They say we're going to go to net zero, but they carefully omit the use of the oil and gas that they sell. And finally, your investments. Many SMEs may laugh slightly hollowly here, but if actually you are part of an organization with major investments, major portfolio, you can do a lot in your scope 3 to reduce your scope 3 emissions by paying careful attention to where your investments are. Are they doing good? Are they not? So you can see that in scope 3, there's quite a lot of discretion and judgment required into what you count. And actually, it's not really meaningful to try and quantify all your scope 3 emissions. So one of the key thing to do is to pick the key scope 3 emissions that are most meaningful for you, and then use what influence you can. So for example, if you were a school, you might say, well, actually, it's the kids coming. You worked out that actually the kids coming to school is a big part of it. So let's see what we can do to get the parents to share lifts when they bring their kids in, for example. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about electricity, green tariffs, which is another area in which people very often, it's very often confusing. So you may think, okay, well, we'll just sign up to a green electricity tariff, and then that they tell us that's 100% renewables. So let's put that as 0 carbon. So now we've suddenly decarbonized. I've got bad news for you. A green tariff, or even one that's portrayed as being 100% renewables, does not mean 0 carbon, unfortunately. And part of this is because even if you have your own solar on the roof, there was some embedded carbon involved in making those solar panels. Not a lot, but some. The other problem comes from the complete confusopoly about how the greenness of electricity is sold round the utility business, the distributors. So the best thing to do if you want to be as green as possible and reduce the genuine carbon emissions from your electricity tariff, which is a very good thing to do, the best thing to do, if you can, is to generate your own electricity. That probably means put some solar on your roof, and don't sell the greenness. So this jargon, the REGO, is the Renewable Energy Guarantee of Origin. It replaces a thing that used to be called the Renewables Obligation, and these are traded. So effectively, you're selling the greenness to somebody else. So if you don't actually have the ability to put solar on your roof, you don't have a roof, you can't afford it, whatever, the next best thing to do is to have a power purchase agreement with a utility company, with a generator. And so basically you're having a contract, and you agree the price and the carbon emissions of that contract, and that's a good thing to be doing. So you can't do that because actually you're a bit small. The next best thing to do would be to just go and look for a green electricity tariff and find one that is 100% based on power purchase agreements. And so, for example, unless it's changed since I last looked, the Good Energy one do have a green tariff that is 100% based on power purchase agreements with providers. And of course, Good Energy also invest quite a bit in putting their own, in doing their own renewables, which is good. The next best thing is a green tariff, which is actually based on buying REGOs. And if you look carefully on websites from companies that are purporting to sell their green tariffs, you actually may notice that actually it's saying, oh yes, we're buying REGOs and therefore we're 100% renewables. That's less good. Unfortunately, when my husband and I looked at this carefully some months ago, we realized that our own electricity tariff, which we get from Green Energy UK, is based on REGO purchases. So when the electricity market opens up again and one can switch, we will probably switch. The worst is a general electricity tariff, especially if you're at peak times. It's always good to be trying to use power away from the peak times, because actually that's more likely to be from wind and solar. So we will take a few questions here. Does anybody have any questions or comments about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, or our green electricity tariffs?
There is a couple in the chat. So we've got one that says, oh, get it to work. Thinking specifically about scope 3, I know there are standard carbon equivalent factors by UK government for many items such as fuel for commuting, but how would quantify have a carbon equivalent factor for things not included in the government spreadsheet, e.g. a production of a magazine? Yeah, that's stuffy. I mean, I will. I mean,
for the rest of you, I will share the links to where you can get these carbon emissions factors. And it is actually really tough. And so producing a magazine, who is it? Can you unmute yourself and explain? Are you making it yourself? Is it your own warehouse, done in your own warehouse, or are you contracting it to somebody else, or what?
Yeah, I think it's contracted to someone else, so I'm not 100% sure. We've just started working on trying to calculate the carbon footprint of our organisation. So I'm now trying to work out all of the areas that we would be including in Scope 3, and we do have quite a big production of a magazine, and I think it's out. We don't have it on site, so I think it's outsourced to another company.
Well, yes, it's outsourced, so it's Scope 3. So things I'd be looking at is a magazine. So how much paper is involved, and is that paper from renewable sources? And if it isn't, why not? Assuming you want to be as green as possible. Is it recycled? And what many companies do, you then go to the people who print your magazine and say, what's the carbon footprint of the magazine? What's your carbon footprint? So everybody is basically, these things rustle down the supply chain. But on the other hand, if you're a small outfit, you may not get much of an answer. If you're Unilever, you may. So I think that one of the key things to do is to try to find the things which are the most significant and relevant for your business. So as a magazine, paper is clearly going to be one of them. How are they distributed? I'd stick a finger in the air and say, well, what's the mileage, and is that done by air, by diesel, by Royal Mail? Work it out, get a rough figure, and then that will start to let you see where are the things that you should focus on. And other things will actually be fairly irrelevant for the moment. So don't let the best be the enemy of the good. And we've probably got time for one more.
So I've got someone asking, how do you find out about power purchase agreement?
I can't give you a precise answer apart from say Google on it. I mean, if you're a big business, and I would also suggest go and look at my best answer has to be Google. I don't, to be honest, precisely know. You might ask David next week, because they do. It may well be one of the things that he also talks about. Okay, I think I can fit another one in, since I couldn't answer that one.
Someone's just asked if you can please explain again what the REGO is. Maybe if you do it in a snapshot, like this recording will go out if you want a recap on any information that we do cover today.
Okay, so I'll just share my screen again. So the REGO is a renewable energy guarantee of origin. And so the grid requires, the UK power system requires all generators to be using a certain percentage of renewables, and if they aren't actually generating their own, they have to buy them in, and so they're effectively buying them in. And the REGO system replaced this Renewables Obligation system, which was a similar sort of certification system, but with some slight variations in order to try and reduce the amount with which the certificates got sold twice, basically, got double counted. So again, it's quite a confusopoly. But if you Google on REGO, or if you look, for example, on a particular utility company, you will Google and search on that within their website. That will probably pick it up where they're describing what their policy is on it. I also suggest when you get the copy of this presentation, you have a look at this U-Switch link that I'm including here, where they've got quite a good way of working out how green different electricity utilities are, and that will also tell you very clear, gives you a clear summary of whether they're using REGOs or whether they aren't. So quite when we'll be able to switch electricity companies again, I'm not quite sure. Okay, so I think I'll now move on, and we'll talk about how you set and communicate your target. Done that. So one of the systems I think is one of the sort of best and soundest base, and okay, I'm a techie by background, is a Science-Based Target Initiative, SBTI. And increasingly big corporations are adopting this approach, which, if done sort of thoroughly, it is actually a pretty intensive thing. But actually, as SMEs and small businesses, we can still follow the spirit of it, even if we don't do it in quite such anal detail. So what that's basically saying is that if we're to avoid catastrophic climate change, we need to be on, worldwide, we need to be on a path to have a temperature rise of no more than 1.5 C. And there's various ways we can do that. And so here's various graphs. So the global gigatons of carbon emissions versus time between 2010 and 2100. And some people will say, well, we'll go down more gently, and then we'll have some magic negative emissions at the end. And some people are saying, well, we'll go down quicker now and not need so much magic negative emissions. So businesses pledge to put themselves on a target to achieve 1.5 by whatever path makes sense to them. And the SBTI categorizes certain sectors as sort of deserving, as it were, of having some negative emission offsets. So, for example, if you are a business that makes concrete, cement, it is actually really, really hard to 100% decarbonize, and there's a value in having cement and concrete around. So there it will be appropriate allocation of this sort of scarce resource of negative emissions, which of course are still hypothetical. We don't know how to do it at scale and at an affordable price. So some of these industries are given an allocation, as it were, in the SBTI of what would be a reasonable rate at which to decarbonize. And other areas, you just got to get down to zero because there's no reason why you shouldn't. And so a few years ago, when SBTI was starting, companies were tending to set themselves, say, we're on a path to 2 degrees C. Now, increasingly, they're saying the target is 1.5 C. And I think on the recent update on the SBTI, it was actually requiring new people to be targeting a 1.5 degrees C temperature rise, which is, of course, scientifically is absolutely essential. And increasingly, though, these are actually also including some key elements of scope 3. They don't have to. So some of them were actually just based on scope 1 and 2, which is a very appropriate way to start. And then when they've got the grips on that, and they've got that clearly coming down on the path to net zero, path to 1.5 C, they start including the key scope 3 things. So I find that a really nice, logical approach. It says you don't have to do it all today, but you have to get yourself on a path. And so then how do you communicate it? So taking the simple basis for a simple SME, this is an example given by the Carbon Trust in the paper that I gave you the link to earlier, in one of the earlier slides. It might say something like, Company X commits to reducing scope 1 and scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030 from a, let's say, 2018 baseline. Company X also commits to measure and reduce scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And by 2050, or whatever date we choose, Company X will be net zero. So that's quite a nice, clear, very reputable statement that you could make, obviously adjusting the numbers and dates as seemed appropriate to you. And I think it's also quite interesting to look at how Microsoft did this. Some of you may have heard that Microsoft say they're going to be carbon negative by 2030. Well, what do they actually mean by that? Well, they have signed up to SBTI, which is good, and they are being clear about what their planning to do, so people can unpack it. You know, you may think it's not fast enough or too fast or whatever, but they're being very clear, which is good. And so here they've got 1975, 2030, and obviously they didn't really exist in 1990. And the Microsoft and its supply chain carbon emissions are here in the pale blue. And they're aiming to reduce those from, I think it was about 2018. And this is actually mostly people using their software and servers and data centers and cloud services and all the rest of it. Their actual operational carbon emissions, i.e. scope 1 and scope 2, is this tiny little red bit down at the bottom. And since, I suppose, about 2012, they have been buying offsets for avoided carbon emissions. And we'll come in the next section, we'll come to some of the games that go on about offsets. And you can see that those, they cancel out the operational carbon emissions, but they don't go anywhere towards cancelling out the carbon emissions due to using Microsoft products. I mean, I don't actually know whether that includes the fact that their bloated Microsoft software means that you keep having to buy a new laptop because the old one can't cope with the latest edition of Windows. I know they were taking action to improve on that. And then from 2020, what they're planning to do is to actually invest over $1 billion in carbon removal, which is actually genuinely, in theory, taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And so by 2030, that will cancel out that, and they will be net zero. So some of it is, which, you know, well, we'll see whether it actually happens, but it's very clear, and it nicely distinguishes between those different categories of their own operations, scope 1, scope 2, the scope 3 emissions that they cause in other people and they have some influence over, avoided emissions and removed emissions. And so I think, you know, in your own businesses, you can do a sort of simpler version of that. And so I've included here a few useful links for you, trying to calculate your emissions. The first one I'm including up here, the Bayes carbon intensity factors. That's the one that whoever it was mentioned earlier, where there's from government spreadsheets of factors that you can use in the carbon emissions per kilometre that you drive in a petrol car, or all sorts of things. And then there's various calculators that various people are offering, which I should perhaps highlight here. The Cambridge Carbon Footprint Charter, which is not an accredited system, but it is, of course, absolutely wonderful. And it's very good as well if you sign up to that and use it. And I think it has some genuinely useful stuff in it, and it also helps show the City Council, who sponsored it, that as businesses in Cambridge we do support climate action. So some useful calculators and accredited measures. There's a thing called the SME Climate Hub, that's sort of done in association or by or for UK government, which seems good, though I haven't really used it in earnest. Carbon Trust has got a free calculator. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol has got a free calculator, and Spherix do one that actually integrates with accounting packages, so with Xero or QuickBooks or whatever, which can be useful. And then again, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has got a free estimator to help you estimate what you're doing. So I guess my overall tip is don't feel you've got to do everything perfectly. The key thing is to try and work out where you think the key questions are, the key issues are, and it may be that 6 months later you'll suddenly discover something else that is key that you hadn't really realised. For example, it's a company called Delta T in Burwell, and they'd done a lot of stuff reducing their carbon emissions, and then they realised when they looked at it that actually the biggest emissions were from how they shipped their products to their customers, and their default was to ship it by air. And when they realized this, they changed the default so that European orders would be sent by surface, and somebody would have to, if you wanted it by air, if they were in a hurry, they could tick the box to say ship it by air. I think 70% of customers kept the default, and it actually dramatically reduced their scope 3 carbon emissions, which apparently was, had been more significant than anything else they'd already done. Right, any questions?
Oh, there's one in the chat. My workplace is rented from the city council, and last week our gas boiler died. Can you recommend the best carbon-free new boiler to go for, or do we need to have a discussion with the council about what alternative to gas supply they are thinking of supplying?
Okay, well, yes, I would say definitely talk to your landlord ASAP, because and you can't really get a carbon-free gas boiler, because gas boilers use gas, and gas it's not as bad as oil, not as bad as coal, but it's not it's not as low carbon option. The best thing to do, if you can, would be to put in a heat pump, and it depends a bit how big your place is. You can have a heat pump put in that would more or less go in the same space, do an air to be effectively be air to water. You can also get small units which are what's called air to air heat pumps, and they look a bit like an air conditioner. And so if you've basically just got a single room, you might find that an air to air heat pump would work, and the cost of installing it would be comparable to the cost of putting in a new boiler. But definitely you need to talk with your landlord, and I would say it's the landlord's job to replace your boiler.
Jill's raising her hand. Jill's the question asker, so if you'd like to expand, Jill.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to say that we've thought about air pumps, but then I think we gather that you can't, they're not really worth it unless your property is really well insulated.
I mean, it is a bit complicated. I mean, in general, if it's in a house, one of the problems is that the air to water ones, which basically work like a boiler, when they put heat from outside, pump the heat into your water, they work. They're most efficient if the radiators are actually running quite low temperatures. So if your existing radiators need to be red hot in order to keep the place warm enough, the only solution is to actually insulate the house so that they can work when they're lukewarm.
So what's the definition of a low temperature?
About 40 centigrade.
Oh,
so
God.
basically,
so,
if it's a 40 centigrade, you can sort of put your hand on something sort of like that.
Oh, okay.
If it's that's about 70 centigrade.
Oh, right. Oh, right. So, because I'm sort of thinking the house temperature, if it
this
it
is
be 18.
The temperature of the radiators. The radiators themselves.
Right.
But
okay.
this air to air one, it looks like an air conditioning unit. I mean, we actually have one in our house here. It's just a box. It's a box that goes on the wall that's about the size of a filing cabinet drawer.
And that's for small spaces.
Yeah, if you basically just got one room, it might be an option. Those don't do hot water, but I think maybe we'll have a discussion separately rather than getting into technical detail. But the first thing to do is talk to your landlord.
Also, Jill, next week we're holding a session that looks more at low carbon technologies and how that can work with like your building, and it takes into consideration like insulation and stuff, so that might be really beneficial for you. And I'll also give you Anne's email at the end if you want to follow up with anything in more detail of this session.
Thank you very much.
Any more questions? I think we're okay for this section.
Okay, good. Okay, I will resume again. Okay, so the next section is what to do about offsetting. And as we saw with Microsoft, an awful lot of what they're planning to do is actually about avoided and removed emissions. And you see a lot of companies saying we're going to be net zero, and actually what they're doing is they're buying offsets. And so are those genuine or are those a con? Well, the answer is sometimes they're genuine and sometimes they're a con. And so again, there's two things to be aware of, the quite important distinction on. So the first thing is that sometimes when people talk about offsets, saying, well, you know, we're going to emit X tons of carbon dioxide, but it doesn't matter as long as somebody else in the world removes X tons of carbon emissions. Or sometimes they're talking about saying, well, they avoid X tons of emissions that they otherwise would have done. So avoided carbon emissions are basically paying somebody else the promise that they will not emit carbon emissions that they hypothetically would have done otherwise under business as usual. And you can see here there's all sorts of scope for things actually not happening as one intended. So for example, somebody might promise that they would otherwise, normally they'd have been cutting down this tropical rainforest, but if you give them some money, they won't. Well, would they have done it otherwise or wouldn't they? Does your does your payment actually make any difference or not? Equally, you see sometimes projects saying, well, we will, you know, if you give us some money, £15 a tonne, say, we will use that to pay for cook stoves for people who would otherwise be burning firewood. Well, will that actually reduce deforestation, or will it just improve the health and livelihoods of those people? Which is obviously a good thing to do. The problem with these avoided emissions, as you can see, this sort of hypothetical basis of what business as usual was. And in surveys recently, you know, quite detailed analysis by the UN, they reckon that most of the avoided emissions under the clean development mechanisms that were happening as part of the UN protocol, most of them actually had no impact on climate emissions, on carbon emissions. Some of them may have improved people's well-being. There may have been things that was quite good to do anyway, but they probably didn't have any impact on reducing carbon emissions. So they didn't work as offsets. The second version of these, which is much better, but there's not much of it around, because actually we haven't really worked out how to do it properly, is rather than talking about avoided emissions, it's removals. And this is actually in a sense what we will ultimately, I fear, need to do. And what this is about paying somebody else to, in theory, permanently remove your emissions from the atmosphere. So that might include planting new forests. I've got a nice illustration here of forest, of a growing forest in Scotland. And here, a very high-tech system from a Swiss company, which in theory is, well, I mean, it does work. It is actually directly taking carbon from the atmosphere and removing it from the atmosphere. The trouble is, you can perhaps get the impression from this figure, from this picture, the cost of doing that is astronomical. So the problem is that some of these systems are, in general, they're expensive, and nature-based solutions are attractive, but we still don't really know a lot about, well, what happens if you you plant new forests, then what happens if the forest burns down in a forest fire? Or some of the science about how much carbon sequestered in soils is actually, we don't know yet. We know it's a good thing to do. We think there may be a point at which the carbon saturates and won't take up any more. You know, there's lots to be discovered. And some of these technical solutions have been described by Professor Kenneth Anderson as magic beans and unicorn blood. they will have a place, but by relying on them to solve our climate problem is, I fear, fantasy. These things, we've got to generate an industry on the scale of the oil industry in 30 years. That is very optimistic, to put it politely. At the bottom of this slide, I've put a link that you might want to watch of a hilarious little video. It's about 5 or 10 minutes long, done by a guy from Cambridge, born and brought up here in Cambridge, Alex Randall, called Cheat Neutral, which looks at offsetting from the point of view of what do you do if you were cheated in love. And it is great fun. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. So offsets and removals, or avoid paying people for things. So how much is, oh sorry, before I jump into that, there's also a compusopoly between carbon neutral and net zero. And so the definitions aren't really haven't universally been agreed, but the way it seems to be going is that when you talk about net zero, you're talking about the SBTI type approach. So you reduce emissions in line with a science-based target of, say, 1.5C. Optionally, you pay compensation for your emissions. You're not pretending that they're actually removing the emissions, but you're basically saying sorry to the planet, sorry to the rest of humanity. And then when you've reduced your emissions as much as you can and you've paid compensation, at the end, you actually pay a small amount, as shown in these little purple blobs here, to actually remove any residual emissions that you have left. For example, if you were making concrete or something. Carbon neutral is rather more fluffy. So you try to reduce your emissions each year, and each year you pay for accredited offsets. It's often just looking at scope 1 and scope 2, and the offsets that it involves are usually avoided emissions rather than removals. And so this illustration came from a group called Climate Care. And so both of them are better than nothing, but don't pretend it's made the emissions go away. So how much is appropriate to pay? Well, if you're compensating for the social cost of carbon, you pay compensation, for example, a voluntary donation. And it's worth bearing in mind that the social cost of carbon has been estimated at between 100 and 400 pounds a tonne. In fact, I think Bayes calculated the cost of unavoidable emissions. I think it was about 240 pounds a tonne was the official DEFRA estimate at the moment. I maybe just need to change that slide. They don't quite call it social cost of carbon anymore. And so it's hundreds of pounds a tonne of carbon dioxide. So the local Cambridge company Max Fordham, who are real experts in sort of architectural energy use, building energy management systems and all the rest of it, they are reducing their carbon emissions. They've done some substantial improvements to their offices, fabric of their offices, to improve energy efficiency. And for their remaining emissions, they donate £100 per tonne for new woodland creation through this particular group called forestcarbon.co.uk. And I think that's a good approach. It puts it on the scale of significance. On a more personal level, what some people are doing is saying, well, if I can't bear it, so I'm going to take that flight and I feel guilty about it. They give a carbon gift of between 10 and 100% of the guilt-inducing expenditure to a charity or a project that's doing something to reduce carbon emissions. Again, as a way of saying sorry. If you buy accredited offsets, Climate Care or the marketplace of goldstandard.org are fairly good places to do it. Some of them are ridiculously cheap. I would say less than £20 a tonne is ridiculously cheap. But of course, you don't have to just buy 1 tonne of carbon offsets per tonne that you do. You could choose to do more. You can try to focus on projects that are removals rather than avoided emissions, and try to find projects that actually appeal to you. I mean, Max Fordham, they build a lot with timber. So they thought forest carbon seemed very appropriate. Find something that appeals to you and enjoy supporting it. Oh, sorry, help. And if you've got investments, decarbonise your portfolio and invest in early stage low carbon businesses. So we are coming up to the end. So are there any more questions? I'll just stop sharing this.
I have one question in the chat. Speaking of greenwashing, so this is from Cambridge Carbon Footprint herself. We've noticed that talking to SMEs, there is like a concern about publicly talking about climate action because they don't want to appear as like greenwashing. Do you have any thoughts or recommendations for businesses on how to approach this issue?
So you say people don't want to talk about climate change because they'll be worried about greenwashing? Is it from Alana or?
This question is from Alana. If like,
Alana, what's the issue that you've noticed?
Yeah, well, I mean, talking to businesses, you know, approaching them to share their experiences about what they're doing. Many of them are hesitant to sort of be publicly on the record about what they're doing because they are worried about how it will be perceived publicly. You know, and from our point of view at CCF, I think we know that everyone's on a different part of their journey, but actually, you know, the more that people are speaking about what they're doing, what they're achieving, but also what they're struggling with, you know, the better it is for everyone. We can all, you know, learn from one another, we can celebrate what is going well, and we can work on the things that aren't going well. But it's a real issue for businesses, you know, in terms of reputation. You know, people are a bit hesitant, and so I just wonder if you had advice for businesses on how to approach this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I can sympathise with businesses that don't want to come out and be so say, well, we know we're an exemplar and we're doing fantastic stuff, because it's the same way that individual householders may well feel very nervous, or certainly celebs feel very, very nervous about talking about what they're doing, because then they get accused of hypocrisy and stuff like that. So my advice would be to take it absolutely in a sort of straightforward business way. Of course, this is what we're doing. And I just sort of share the screen that I showed earlier. You know, this sort of framing of just saying, well, we're committing to reduce our scope 1 and scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions by half. And if you'd actually been doing that a few years, you might be able to say, well, over the last 2 years, we've reduced them by 30% or something. You know, then that's just being very, you know, professional about it. And I just recently saw something pointing out that how all the most exciting businesses of the future weren't going to be in, you know, artificial intelligence or tech. They were going to be clean tech businesses. Those are the ones where the big blockbuster, the next, you know, the next Facebooks and the like. Okay,
so focusing on, sorry, focusing on transparency rather than sort of marketing claims.
Yes, yes, people are rightly twitchy about making marketing claims that aren't well founded. So start by working out what your target is, you know, what your emissions are, and declare your target.
We have one more question in the chat. So it seems like offsetting brackets removal is the only way to reach net zero. What's the best way to do that as a charity?
Well, I'd say the first thing is to be reducing your emissions. And actually, it should be easy to halve your emissions. I mean, David will have loads of ideas next time. And if you've got particular questions, I guess, you know, drop Jasmine an email with particular questions that you might have, so that he can, you know, make sure he addresses those. But yeah, getting to zero. I mean, zero is an awfully small number. And some of what will happen is that, for example, when we actually have a renewable electricity system and the storage systems that mean that we are largely at, you know, electricity is extremely decarbonised, your electricity use will be very low carbon. So some things will get easier over the next decade. And I would say the other thing is to say, well, we will pay for offsets for our surplus, for the emissions that we currently have. And as a charity, of course, you can only do things that are in accordance with your charitable purpose. So if, for example, it was a climate change charity, I would say you then need, I would say, be very clear about what you're doing, very transparent about it, so that you are it's part of your charitable purpose because you're inspiring others, and choose projects to support with your donations that are something to do with climate change. For example, it might be you decided to give out grants, small grants to your volunteers to help them reduce their carbon emissions, or it might be that you decided to plant woodland, or whatever it was. Has that answered the question?
Yeah, I think so. Sorry, I think so.
Okay.
I've got a sort of a part 2 based on what you said, if it's all right.
It's got to be
or
very, very quick.
Okay, so
I think Jasmine has a few things to say at the end. Housekeeping.
I can hold it if that's all right.
I can give you Anne's email as
Okay.
well. We'll give you Anne's email,
Okay.
and you can correspond
Thank
over
you.
that if you'd like.
Okay, right. So I will just come back to give you a slide. Sorry, I'm just losing where I was on my PowerPoint, and I will share it just as a final slide. Okay, so just in conclusion, so my final things to take away is start by setting your 2030 scope 1 and scope 2 target. And I would suggest that at the very least that should be to halve your emissions from scope 1 fuel and scope 2 electricity. And measure, declare, and reduce them. Get on with it. And I think you'll probably initially you'll find it really easy. To go further, identify your key scope 3 emissions and start reducing them. Don't bother to find everything, but just find the ones that feel really important to your business. And I was just finding exciting projects in terms of offsetting. Find exciting projects and support them by paying compensation for your unabated emissions. But in general, the key thing is to be transparent about your approach and your assumptions, because this stuff is changing. And if you are transparent and say what you're doing, and just have a good little section on your website, then people won't accuse you of greenwash. Share what you're doing and help others, because that's a really powerful way of helping this movement grow and increasing your leverage. And as well, buy from low carbon businesses where you can, which is also part of helping decarbonize your own supply chain. And you'll probably end up buying from nice people. Great. So thank you very much. I will just put my contact details up there, and over to Jasmine. I'll leave that there for a minute.